All right. So I see the count here. All right, so we're live. I should be getting the count. All right. So I'll have us wait for 2 to 4 minutes, I want to say. Just, you can never really know how the technicals work, but people will roll in naturally. So
does it tell you how many people are in?
Yeah, so none of them are 14. Hello.
Hi.
Good evening, everyone. That was bizarre. It went from 0 to 14. Technology is smoke and mirrors. Okay, for those joining us, we're just waiting a few minutes for other people to join, and then we'll start. Have you used this platform before, Kieran?
I've spoken on it before like this, but not used it myself. I did one a few months ago actually, and they had a fancy countdown with stars and things, and that's what that was about. It was great. It was funny, but
Right. Yeah, interesting. I think there's a whole new paradigm shift with virtual presence these days that we might in-person interaction might become a foreign thing. Who knows? We'll see. The vaccine rollout is what, 5 million now, so we're getting there.
We're getting there slowly but surely.
Okay. 17.
I'm used to doing this on Facebook though. I've never actually done a live on YouTube.
No. Do you get to see what information do you get as a speaker on Facebook Live? Is it?
It's pretty much the same. When people comment, you don't see their names unless they have to give permission. There's a button that you can press at the top and they give permission, but that's pretty much it. So you can see the comments come up. It's just set up exactly the same.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. For those joining us, we're just taking a few minutes, just so people have a chance to sign in, access the link. And I think we'll start maybe a minute. So just settle in, get some water or a snack. We're looking at 45 minutes.
Did you lose me for a second there?
I thought it froze a bit, but okay, yeah. Hopefully the connection. Yeah, it'd be terrible if we just a huge glitch right in the middle of a point.
Every child in the country is on their PlayStation or Xbox right now, aren't they? So
yeah, I know. Yeah, we're hoping this works. Okay. Yeah, I think we start now. That sounds good. So, good afternoon, everyone joining us. Welcome for another Sen Explained talk. The idea behind these talks is to move the conversation, the cultural conversation around SEN forward by including individuals with lived experience and experts in the field of SEN. My name is Valenza. I work at Sen Talk. We're a charity based in South London, which aims to provide better social and emotional mental health outcomes for children and young people with special educational needs and their families. So if you're joining us live, feel free to add your questions on the chat. It should be on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll try to respond to as many of them as we can after our dialogue today. If you're watching the YouTube recording after the fact, feel free to add comments below and continue the discussion. So today, we're privileged to be joined by Kieran Rose. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm good, thank you. Enjoying being at work actually, because the kids are all at home. So this is a nice break.
So do you do you do work in the when the kids are not? You have to do at-home learning then?
Yeah, we're doing lots of home. One of my children is home educated anyway, but the other two are doing home learning right now,
Do you
which
have
is
to
fun.
adjust the work schedule a little bit?
Yeah. Work kind of goes out the window, and obviously 3 children into 2 adults doesn't really work either. So
I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that.
yeah,
Yeah, sounds like you're doing okay though.
we're getting
we
there.
have we have this talk now. That's good. Okay, so yeah, so we'll start off. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I am the parent of 2 autistic children, and a further neurodivergent child of undetermined origin at the moment. um,
Or
and I myself was diagnosed as autistic when I was 23, which was about 18 years ago. And I am a writer, consultant, trainer, and apparently now I'm academically published as well, which is quite nice. So that's kind of me in a nutshell. My background also is in schools and primary education as well. I was a high-level teaching assistant for well over a decade. So
so okay, so you've been doing work directly in SEN, would you say about 10
yeah,
years?
yeah,
Okay. That's great. So I guess the topic we're discussing today that we want to delve into is masking on the autism spectrum. So to provide a background and backdrop, autistic masking is something only recently recognized by researchers and professionals, and evidenced by your recent publication a few days ago. It continues to emerge with attention to different dimensions in the research. Still, there's not a lot of guidance in this area when it comes to how people ought to manage and basically why it happens in the first place, why it emerges as a social strategy or a coping mechanism. So I guess coming from your own words, how would you describe what masking is?
sure. Masking is a trauma response. The current kind of research talks about it very much in terms of social strategies. But the current research is, as you said, very, very kind of early on, and it's quite superficial at the moment. It's very much about external observations and missing the kind of the insight. But I would define it as a trauma response. It's a kind of safety mechanism where you grow up in a world which is constantly invalidating you, in which you are under the cosh of kind of different sensory attacks and assaults. Your communication is invalidated, your behavior is invalidated, and when you get overwhelmed, then that's invalidated as well, in terms of how things are stigmatized and pathologized and stuff. It's so what it's really about is projecting an acceptable version of yourself, however that looks, and kind of meeting the needs of the confirmation bias of the people that are around you. So whether that's teachers or whether that's adults of various forms, other children, or growing up other adults. And it's kind of, there is an element of a natural human behavior to this, because all humans engage in something called context switching, which is where we behave a little bit differently around different groups of people. So we might be slightly different when we're with our friends than we are when we're with our colleagues, or so on and so on. But for this, there's these extra added layers, that there are these very, very complex and complicated strategies that are basically created to keep you safe and to stop you being kind of persecuted and othered and separated and pushed out of the kind of the group. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. There's obviously far deeper and far more complex than that, but that's the kind of nutshell version.
Yeah, and I love your attention to um, the social context, which is we look at behavior as a symptom of a social landscape, right? And I think when we look at it as coping, and we're developing strategies and support, paradigms, basically, it's that and so it's intriguing as a coping strategy, how we might further pathologize it, and we can get into it. But this whole idea that it's a presentation, autistic people are presented with a message that their way of being is basically defunct.
Yeah.
That is the foundation of masking, I think, in
Yeah.
your view, which sort of considers context. So with that said, why have you contributed to this research? Why is it an important topic? Why are we?
I mean, it's an important topic in terms of understanding that firstly, this isn't just an autistic behavior. This happens across different marginalized groups. The Black community for a long time have been talking about kind of passing as white, and people from LGBTQIA plus backgrounds talk very much about fitting in and that kind of notion. But it's important to me personally because it's something that has personally affected me. It's something that I see within my children and lots of the children that I've worked with and the adults that I work with and the people amongst my community who I talk to every day. And this is, I've been actively part of the autistic community for nearly a decade now. And it's kind of, these are conversations that happen all the time. And it's very much this notion of fitting in isn't right. And it's never sat right with me. Because there's a kind of, and this again is kind of in academia, masking at the moment, it's actually called camouflaging, and it's broken down into kind of 3 areas. And one of them is very much about that notion of fitting in. So it's called compensation. So the idea behind it is that we're compensating for not being not autistic. So it's like we're striving to be not autistic and we want to be not autistic, and we're kind of filling the gaps in that in order to kind of be like everyone else. And that's not it at all. There's a kind of this whole deeper layers behind there, which is very much, like I said before, around kind of invalidation and the trauma that you experience from that, and being dismissed, which is quite often happens. And sensory's really at the heart of this, because this is where it really starts as a kind of when you're very, very young, that you have certain sensory reactions to things, and people dismiss that because they don't experience those things. And in autistic children, we know that the sensory system is such an important part of being autistic, and that we do experience sensory information in a very, very different way from non-autistic people. That gets dismissed early on, and you're expected to get on with things and just cope, but there's still the expectations from you are that you will do the same things as everybody else, despite the fact you're doing all this extra hard work. Automatically you are being invalidated before you've gone anywhere. So because you've got nowhere to shout up to and no one's listening to you, all you can do is swallow it. Right. And push it down inside you and just keep going like everybody else keeps going. But eventually, this is where this is why I think that it's so much deeper, is that as this goes on throughout our lifespan, it's really, really common that we dissociate from what we're doing. So it becomes our normal behavior to just suppress everything and suppress our reactions and not react to invalidating things about our communication and behaviors and stuff like that. We just eat it and eat it and eat it, and that's a really unhealthy thing to do.
Yes, and trauma, if we look at masking through the lens of trauma, I think it's really a useful tool, because we're able to see trauma. I think Gabor Mate, the physician speaker, he said that trauma is a loss of self. So when we have models of behavior that is boxed in, we have certain ways of being and perceiving that are accepted, we lose that opportunity for the groups of people to feel like their authentic self. So it's this tension between acceptance and authenticity, or really being in a true sense of self or true sense of expression. And I think masking is very much it's giving up that authenticity for the sake of being accepted, because being accepted is a human need. But like you're saying, it has real negative implications for outcomes when we're talking about late diagnoses, misdiagnoses, real intense health issues, brain-body connection, gut problems. It's all an after effect of wanting to be accepted, compensating, and they have real serious implications when it comes to life outcomes, health outcomes. So to touch on that, to build on that a little bit, can you share with us how has masking been a part of your life? in whatever way you want to construe it.
Well, I mean, you know, when I touched on just before about kind of sensory stuff and it starting really, really early, one example I quite often give is that I am extremely sensitive to touch. I'm very, very touch averse. Touch, skin to skin contact for me actually causes me pain. It's like a burning sensation. So when I was a baby and my parents, who, you know, they're past now, my dad's passed and my mum's in a care home now. So, but earlier on in my life, when we talked about these things, they recognized that as a baby, I was probably in pain a lot of the time. But when a baby is in pain, when if you have this baby that is a touch averse and you touch it, it cries. So what do we do when a baby cries? We touch it more, we pick it up, we wind it, we feed it, we change its nappy, and we go through this constant process of touch. So looking back retrospectively and from building a picture from what my parents kind of told me, eventually I stopped crying. But I'm still touch averse now and it still causes me pain. So that pain never went away. So to my mind, the process that my kind of subconscious or unconscious brain went through was that no matter what I do, all I'm doing is drawing attention to myself by reacting to this pain. So if I stop reacting to pain, maybe the touching will be minimized a little bit more. So, you know, so when you look at, so when you look at it like that, actually, this is a baby that hasn't been desensitized. It's a baby that stopped reacting because it's been invalidated. And then as you build layers and upon layers of that, as you grow up, because obviously, you know, touch isn't my only sensory, like issues around sensory stuff. I have issues around sound and light and all of those kind of things. And I remember as a child being dismissed because, clothes didn't feel right, or because, you know, or different sounds caused me pain but they didn't cause anybody else pain, so I was overreacting or being dramatic. And very quickly you learn just not to bother complaining about it anymore, you know. So kind of when you're going through this process, and there's one story I tell about when at primary school, when I was about 6 or 7. I remember being called, going into the cloakroom before school. So all the other children were in there and there was lots of noise and crashing and banging, you know, as you would imagine a class of school cloakroom would be. And I waited for all the other children to disappear because I knew that the thick, heavy doors, once they shut, that would be a moment of silence for me. You know, and I remember hanging on to that moment for as long as I possibly could, usually until a teacher came and grabbed me by the scruff of the neck and dragged me into class. But, you know, so I remember hanging on to that moment, not knowing really why I was doing it, but knowing that it felt okay to do. But then obviously then being dragged into school and having to go through all the things at school. And, you know, I was very much, the way that I presented was very much as the good boy. You know, I would get on with my work and I would sit very quietly and I would not be disruptive and all of those things. But actually inside, I was like eating up pain. And I remember it being such an awful experience, but I just kept quiet and I kept to myself. And because I felt like I couldn't say anything, which was further issue, I'm selectively mute as well. So within that kind of thing, it was kind of, but also I'm hyperlexic, and my hyperlexia punched through my selective mutism quite often. So even when I felt like I couldn't talk, I was forced to by my brain that wanted to talk, you know. So I had all these different things going on, but nobody noticed because I just sailed through. I was the child that kind of didn't achieve great things but didn't do badly, just was middle of the road all the way through, and it was missed. And that story is so common amongst not only autistic men but autistic women, people who present as non-binary, all of those kind of things. So it's a real kind of relatable, normal experience for a lot of autistic people. But then the flip side of that, sorry just to keep talking, is that you have autistic people that say that like, I can't mask, you know, I never mask. But that's because the traditional view of masking is that it's social strategies to fit in. But something stuck with me a few years ago when I had I was having a conversation with an autistic person that said I couldn't mask, I was blatantly autistic. Anytime I was around anyone, I took my autism out and I polished it, meaning they exaggerated everything, which again is masking, you know. So it's about what the people who you are around perceive that they need from you. You just give it to them.
Yeah.
and that keeps you safe because you're performing as to expectations.
Right.
You're not diverse, you're not distracting anyone, you're not being disruptive. You are doing exactly what people expect of you, so therefore you're not being you, you're not being authentic in that moment. You're
Interesting.
just projecting this different version of you.
Right. Yeah, and it's grappling with an image of the self
Yeah.
as you go through this process of socializing. If you don't have that model or that representation that what I'm doing is okay, uh, did you get to a point where you felt this pain is normal or this?
Yeah, to a degree. I mean, it's really common, like I said, for autistic people to dissociate from what we're doing, in terms of kind of masking and stuff. So earlier on, there's a kind of awareness that you're maybe choosing to do certain things in order to keep yourself safe, but eventually it just becomes normalized behavior. And then you dissociate it from it often so strongly that late diagnosed people talk about their mask kind of cracking and them not even realizing there was a mask, and then being horrified because there's this whole other person underneath and they don't know who they are. So it's like there's literally been a schism and there's two people being created kind of thing. And there's a sociologist called Webb Du Bois who was talked about kind of marginalization and oppression amongst Black people in the earlier 20th century, and he came up with this notion of double consciousness, literally because the Black people that he talked to and he talked about and studied talked about the fact that they needed to present this other version of themselves when they were around white people, but eventually they did it so often that the other version was the version that remained, and the real version of them was kind of suppressed underneath that. And it's kind of so this is why I think it's so important, because it cross-references amongst all different marginalized groups. We all do it in our own kind of particular way, but the outcome and the reasons are exactly the same. And it's
Yeah.
just so hard, and it's such a huge topic.
Yeah, and like you're saying, to get to a point where you've dissociated so much where your authentic reactions get repressed and pushed down, where you don't have those reference points of how does this intuitively feel, making decisions based off of perhaps based on these reference points, but really there's survival cues that are always in effect. So it's this for a lot of people that are neurodiverse that do adapt this mindset, it's a survivalist mechanism. And so I suppose like creating safe spaces for yourself like that.
Yeah.
And just having a coat room or having a community is that reclaiming of what is authentic to me, and sort of saying like this is these are identities that I put on, but it is not me. And that's huge. It's a huge unearthing, isn't it?
And this is why, I mean, so many of the parents that will be watching this will probably recognize what I call the Coca-Cola effect in their children, where they spend all day in a kind of school environment existing like this. And then at the end of the school day, when they see their mum or their dad, or they get home to a kind of safe place or safe person, then they erupt. Everything comes pouring out, meltdown central. And that's literally the kind of what you were just saying. It's kind of it's getting to the point where actually I'm in a place where I can be more authentically me. But you have all of this suppressed stuff that just needs to erupt out of you, all of this pent up energy that you've absorbed, and all this negativity and different kind of reactions to pain and all of those kind of things that you've literally held in all day. And then it gets to a point where it's kind of, there's my safe person, that's my rock, my anchor. So it's a kind of, lots of parents are kind of feel awful that their children are reacting like this, but to a degree it's actually a compliment from their child to the parent, because that shows that parent is a safe person for them to be authentically themselves around. And it's
and I suppose for parents, for carers, for closer people around a child or a young person, it's being able to cue into cue into that process a little bit. So being an advocate, in a certain sense, being an ally, and being able to say, and we find a lot of our parents that use our services are advocating for the best interest of the child, trying to create a space in the classroom, or at least spaces within an educational setting that works for them. But it's this rectifying all of these different contextual shifts that a child's asked to do. And so, yeah, and I guess I just want to go into a little bit with how masking for a young person might present as might present and be interpreted by people as mental health issues, or go into sort of the misdiagnosis that happens. Do you want to touch on a little bit of your experience with that?
Sure. I mean, it's commonly unrecognized by professionals across the board, particularly kind of educational professionals. And having worked in the school system, you know, I'm not one to bash teachers, because I think teachers do an amazing job with the kind of the limited resources and time that they have. But we need to focus around the kind of the term inclusion. And even what you described there, you know, like creating spaces within a school and things like that, that's not inclusion. You know, if a child can't exist in the same environment as other children and be authentically themselves, then they're not included. It's simple. If they can't access education in the same way as other children, they're not included. So, you know, so I think it's important to kind of to focus on that word when we think about masking, because the reason that masking occurs in school is because the child is not included. And how that kind of looks is in terms of, I mean, communication is a really, really obvious one. Autistic people exist in a world where we are working 100% of the time to meet the needs of non-autistic people. We are expected to communicate like non-autistic people. We're expected to exist like non-autistic people. And there's no middle ground. There's never, ever a middle ground. It's always, you know, we are the one who put through social training and all of those kind of things. And there is so much research coming out now, which is catching up with the autistic community, which kind of highlights the fact that the things that we talk about, actually, we do not have we do have deficits in the way that non-autistic people communicate, but non-autistic people also have deficits in the way autistic people communicate.
Absolutely.
And the same with kind of sensory processing. You know, we do process sensory information differently. That doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means that we process it differently. But the world at the moment is set up for non-autistic people in the way that non-autistic people process sensory information. So it's, at the moment, there's a kind of this attitude that non-autistic people are kind of a gold standard. And you know that, you know, even with the diagnostic criteria, we are measured up against non-autistic people. So of course we have deficits in being non-autistic, because we're not you know, we're not non-autistic. You know, we are autistic. So but if it was gone the other way, if non-autistic people were measured up against us, they have deficits in being autistic, you know. So when you look at it from that perspective, how this kind of presents in school is often a masking autistic child will either be the one that goes, ta-da, here I am, you can't not miss me, or they'll be the quiet one, the one that kind of maybe sits quietly, maybe has minimal friends. It's really, really difficult, because there are so many different strategies that incorporate this. And when I do training on this, you know, I've got what I call an indicator sheet, and it's got like 25 different things on it. It's things like mirroring, using directed echolalia, using scripting, again, like I said, kind of suppressing sensory information, suppressing things like pain, suppressing emotional reactions to things as well. And often the best indicator of whether a child is masking is that Coca-Cola effect. Because if there's a huge disparity in behavior between what happens at home and what happens at school, then there's something missing there. There's something in between that somebody hasn't picked up on. And quite often the problem is that so many autistic people are missed because we have this really narrow diagnostic criteria that doesn't measure an autistic person as whether they're autistic or not. It measures an autistic person as whether they're stressed or not, because they're all stress behaviors, which are exaggerated by stress. So even the NHS diagnostic process in the UK is set up to only really identify stressed autistic people who are struggling, who are suffering. So if you have an autistic person that's actually doing okay, they're never ever going to be seen as autistic.
Right, you know? Exactly. It's this whole I suppose the deficit model of disability, where, or you can look at it from a social standpoint, is if we had all these support structures in place, all the sort of platforms that work for every way of being or seeing, would disability exist per se? Because in that sense, there are enough social spaces. People are enabled with the type of social communication interaction, with the type of careers that work. And so it is a really good question, is the ways in which we stop ourselves from I suppose enabling the highest potential by seeing it first through the deficit lens. So it's so intriguing. Like you said, getting to the diagnostic criteria itself is an echo of that trauma response. And so to dive into that a little bit, it seems like we as a society have sort of settled with our theories of autism, and from the very early stages of when autism was first sort of recorded and historically recorded. And so in that sense, we've rarely gotten the opportunity to see true and diverse representations of autistic thinking present in research, not media representations. So I wanted to discuss that a little bit more, this historical social context of autism. So how would you, I mean, we've spoken about it a little bit, but how do you think autism is generally understood and conceptualized in the present day? Through what model?
It's it's very much for a deficit model, and also a behavioral model. It's autism has traditionally, I mean, going back to Asperger and Kanner, autism has been about observation, about non-autistic people or perceived non-autistic people observing autistic people doing certain things. And I think part of the problem is that it's kind of it's like anthropomorphization, when you attribute human behaviors to kind of an inanimate object or an animal or something like that. To a degree, that's not me saying that autistic people aren't human, but to a degree, it's kind of people have put behaviors on and reasons for behaviors on us. They've decided that we are doing certain things because of certain reasons, but that's all been done through a lens of bias. That's all been done, I would react like that, so therefore they must be reacting for the same reason. When in actual fact, it isn't like that at all. You literally have, as an autistic person, this neurological system that works completely differently, that processes information differently. So sometimes takes longer to process it, sometimes is quicker to process. And when you have information flowing through your body like that, and it's kind of, as a neurology 101, we all have filters within our body that inhibits the flow of sensory information to come through, so our brain isn't overwhelmed by sensory information. In autistic people, they work differently, so more tends to get through, so the brain then has to pick out what's important. So if you think about that in a developing child, if the brain is picking out what's important, this explains often why many autistic children don't speak until later. A lot of autistic children don't walk until later, but you have this brain that's picking through what's relevant and focusing on what's important. So you might have a child that doesn't speak, but if they had the capacity to read at that age, they could probably read adult level books, which is hyperlexia. So an apraxia as well can be explained by an overwhelm of sensory information. So the messages don't go from the brain to certain parts of the body, or apraxia of speech, where they don't get to the muscles, and so the mouth can't make muscle movements in the right way. But that doesn't mean that person or that child isn't developing in a way that they need to. But it's been assumed that they're not developing in a way that they need to because they're not developing typically. So there's a lot of assumption framed around this. And as we said before we came on camera, we were talking a little bit about this, and all of our understanding of autistic people is based on kind of 25 children that Hans Asperger and Leo Kanner looked at in the 40s and 50s. So all of our understanding is based on that presentation that they had in front of them. Nothing's really deviated from all that time. I mean, we're talking like 90 years later, 80, 90 years later, and no real change in the thinking around how autistic people present. And the key thing that's been missing for all that time is insight. There's been no insight brought into the decision-making process or the thinking process about autistic people. But also alongside that, you've got this other narrative around kind of behavior and behavioralism, where it has been made prevalent that autistic people are broken non-autistic people, that we're missing bits, basically. So if we can
That's a good
fill
one.
those gaps, and if we can make autistic people behave like non-autistic people, it's like sticking band-aids and plasters all over someone, you know, like to try and hold them together. That's effectively the thinking that's been behind all this. But actually we've reached a point now where probably in about the last 5 years there have been a lot of changes in research, and there has been a lot of changes in kind of a very base level professional understanding, but that's going to take decades to filter out into the world. And you know, and we're recognizing now that autistic people don't have deficits in communication, because we actually communicate really well amongst ourselves. You know, that our sensory differences are that they're differences, that they're not necessarily deficits. And you know, I don't want to move away from the whole the idea of being disabled, because I feel that autism is a disability. Right now, we live in a world where we are disabled by barriers that are put in front of us, but many of those barriers are things that are out of everybody's control. You know, like I'm very averse to the light, so no one's going to turn off the sun for me, so the sun therefore disables me. So you know, so it's there are always going to be aspects that disable us, but at the moment, much of our disability is framed around the barriers that are put in front of us by this kind of century of thinking that hasn't changed and hasn't gone away anywhere. I mean, even now, people are still teaching about the kind of the triad of impairments, which actually is theories were debunked about 20-25 years ago, but they're still being taught every day now, you know. So it's this whole thinking is completely messed up.
Right. Yeah, and like you were saying, I really liked that way you distinguished it is the external behavioral presentation, which so easily looks like you can so easily cap on sort of this is what executive functioning looks like. And I was just reading a piece that you sent on monotropism, which do you want to just explain what that is a bit? And then
Sure. So this is called the unified theory of autism. So it's kind of it's actually a theory that's been developed by autistic people, and it kind of works. It works really well, actually. Basically, the principle is that if you are autistic, and other neurodivergencies kind of fall under this banner as well, ADHD in particular, you have an interest-led brain. So everything about your brain needs something to kind of spark it and to really, really kind of grab its attention. And when you have that attention, it's all you want to think about. You want to go running towards it at 400 miles an hour and just learn everything about it. So it means you can deep dive into certain subjects. And this is where we kind of get into the notion of kind of, I don't like the term special interest because it's quite pathologizing again, but you know, that's where that idea kind of comes from, that we kind of have something that interests us and we want to learn everything about it, and everything we do is about that kind of thing. And it's not usually just about one thing. Usually there's other things alongside that as well. So it's not just a singular thing. But the flip of that is that non-autistic people tend to have polytropic brains, which is where there are multiple interests. So your attention is drawn by lots of different things, and you can kind of multitask lots of different things at the same time. But underneath that, I look at that as quite superficial, because you don't dive as deeply into those kind of topics, and you can't have that knowledge base, that deep knowledge base about things. And this is kind of why, you know, there's a joke that runs through the autistic community that the academia aspect, the aspect of academia that looks at autism is very much filled up with undiagnosed autistic people. Because as a PhD, as someone doing a PhD, you can deep dive into a subject. You don't have people restricting what you can do with that subject. You know, you don't have prescribed rules around it. You can spend ages researching and digging deep into things. And, you know, so it's kind of, there are aspects of the world when you look around that actually are very set up to work really well for people with monotropic brains. But that also feeds into kind of the sensory system around transitions and things as well, because if your brain is charging towards something, to transition away from that thing and do something that you're really not that interested in, like, I don't know, going to the shops or whatever, it can be really difficult to transition. So all your sensory system, which is really dysregulated when you're having to transition, needs to get into line before you can make a safe transition. So you need lots of preparation to make that transition. And you know, you can see how it all starts to kind of fall into place. But it's a really, really kind of interesting notion. It's something I really ascribe to.
Yeah, and so in that lens, it's sort of interesting to look at to start reframing what we view as the medical model of disability by saying, okay, the brain, this is not an impairment in the executive functioning. It's just a different way of going about sort of this process. It's a different sort of focus. It's a different sort of way of receiving sensory information. So it's quite interesting. And so where do I go from there? So this whole pathologized status, which we can bring back to the subject of masking, leads to stigma, marginalization, this dehumanization, and masking occurs as a result as that trauma. So looking at masking as a symptom of really largely misunderstanding and not making space for neurodivergent ways of being, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So let me, where do I want to take this?
So I said 45 minutes wasn't enough, didn't I?
I think something interesting might be is, so touching on this research that you've recently co-produced and published. So it's titled, for everyone watching, A Conceptual Analysis of Autistic Masking, Understanding the Narrative of Stigma and the Illusion of Choice. So from that research you put together, which you said took some time to summarize and to get reviewed, what is the current narrative around masking that professionals, parents, everyone at large faces, and what is it missing when it comes to that context?
Okay, so the current narrative, I mean, really there's two that we really touched on in that paper, in terms of the current narrative being that it is just a series of social strategies. It's as simple as that an autistic person walks into the room, puts this mask on, performs, and then takes it off again when they leave, which we know is very much not the case. And the secondary thing to that as well is actually about gender. I'm going to start that with 4 minutes left to go. But around kind of, there's this whole new narrative where they've basically decided that autistic women and girls who have been less identified than autistic men, there are, in my opinion, there are equal numbers of autistic women and girls, but have been less identified. But the reason that they've been less identified is because they mask better, which has then led them to come up with this idea of phenotypes, which is a kind of, oh, well, autistic women and girls, because they mask better, that must mean they have a different autism. They have female autism, which we know, there is no evidence to point to gender brains at all. So to say that there is a female presentation of autism isn't right. There is autism, and then there are sex differences, physical sex differences, which incorporate different things. So it's kind of victim blaming. It's kind of saying that from a professional point, we haven't seen all these autistic women and girls, not because we look through a lens of sexism, not because the diagnostic criteria is framed around kind of typically presenting boys who present in a certain way, but it's because you were all hiding from us.
Right.
So
terrible.
Yeah, and but the problem is that this is kind of out there now, that there is this assumption that autistic girls are completely different to autistic boys, and obviously there are sex differences in physically how people present, but we have to look at how people are gendered and how they're brought up with gender stereotypes, and a lot of autistic girls and a lot of autistic women mask in a certain way, which is about kind of, especially around stims, there's a lot of like things like hair twirling and things like that, and so it's kind of, as you've just done, so it's kind of like people doing that as a stim, or playing with earrings and things like that, so there's a narrative there that a lot of autistic women and girls are playing up to gender stereotypes, unwittingly, obviously, but this is how they've been shown that it's safe to be a woman, so it's kind of, so you again are kind of projecting this acceptability, you're projecting this kind of thing that meets this expectations of everyone that around you. So within that, there's this, I mean, don't get me wrong, autistic women and girls need massive focus because they have been missed, but now that focus is on them for the wrong reasons. And that focus is a kind of excuse for professionals to kind of step away and say, well, it's not our fault. we don't have to change what we're doing. This is about now how you're presenting in a different way, which isn't true, of course, you know. And this whole lens of sexism is just, it makes me angry. And like someone said to me the other day, if you're looking at this through a lens of feminism, then actually you need to break it down like this, because when you take the focus off of one group and put it on the other group, on another group, for the completely the wrong reasons, you set up more stigma and you set up more myths, and it just causes more problems than it solves.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's I think it's calling, you know, everyone where they find contextually relevant to look at how is this child or young person experiencing identity, and how is socialization, how are they experiencing that, and sort of making space for all of that to be had and to be conversed, extrapolated, because like you're saying, the experiences are nuanced, but masking, as I said, is just sort of this loss of, it's this veiling we have against, you know, our true identity, our true response, our true processes. So that's really wonderfully said, what you've said. And so I guess we can again, last few questions here. So I want to bring it back to one point you made earlier, which is different. So this double empathy problem, which is an idea that was put forward by Damien Milton, who's an autistic author, consultant, and lecturer. And so he came up with this, like you're saying, within the past 5 years, more autistic-led research is coming to light. And so this double empathy problem suggests that it's not only on the spectrum this happens, but with regards to neurodiversity as a whole, whether it's, you know, it's interacting with different cultures, it's interacting with different class, race, social status. And he says, suggesting that the double empathy problem says that people with different experiences of the world interact with one another, and they struggle to empathize with one another. And that's the basis, right? Struggling to put oneself in the other shoes. And like you're saying, it needs to go both ways. It's not only the problem of the individual with autism to understand the individual without. It goes both ways. And I think instead of looking at that deficit focus, looking at that ableism, really, what are some ways we can encourage more broad understandings, or what are ways we can create space for different ways of being and seeing? I mean, what can we start doing on the ground?
How do we fix the world?
I mean, it's a really big question.
It's a huge question, but it kind of has a simple answer to a degree. So I look at the issue as a cultural difference. So amongst the autistic community, it's like we're a culture that's been disseminated across the world. So we all have relatable experiences, we all communicate in very, very similar ways, and we all think, you know, around the kind of same subjects and situations very similarly. We produce art, we produce poetry, language, technology. You know, like when you start looking at that, there is cultural substance to the autistic community. So if you took someone from one country and dropped them in another country with no context whatsoever, so there would be communication barriers, there will be cultural barriers, there will be social barriers, even simple hand gestures would be completely different. So you would be hitting a wall of culture. So there would be a culture clash there. So you would have people that would then have to learn to translate, that would need to build bridges. And, you know, but at the moment we have, if you look at it through that lens of culture, we have a very small autistic community and a very large world peopled with non-autistic people. So all of the work at the moment is being done by the autistic people, as I kind of mentioned earlier. You know, like we change who we are in order to make other people not persecute us. So there needs to be a lot more effort from the wider world to respect difference, to respect that there are people who exist differently, there are people who think differently, and actually try, if you want true inclusion, you need to start accommodating. And it's kind of moving there, you know, there's always that picture of the kind of equality and equity kind of thing with the kids that are standing on a box looking at the baseball field and stuff and looking over the fence, and then someone takes the fence down, and that's kind of equity. But we also need to start moving on one step further than that, which is not about, you know, equality can't exist. Everybody can't be equal. That's not possible. Equity, where you kind of start putting in things in place to platform people and make sure that they can have access to the same spaces, that's equity. That's great. But we need to move on to justice, where we start thinking about people before we design buildings, before we create education systems. We need to start tearing things down and rebuilding them in order to really include all sorts of different people. And this isn't just autistic people. This is people from all different racial backgrounds, physical backgrounds, disability backgrounds, religious background. You know, we need to start thinking about different aspects of humanity. As I said to you before we came on, the amount of hubris it takes to think that humans can only exist in one way and have to exist that way, when every other species on the planet, of animal, of flora, of fauna, all have so much diversity within them, but we have to fit this narrow box, and we all have to fit like this in order to be able to achieve anything, to, you know, and it's ridiculous to think like that. You can't think like that, and that's huge answers. But, you know, bringing it back down to that cultural thing, even within a school, you know, thinking about if you had a child that came in that spoke a foreign language and English was their second language, how many accommodations would you make to help them, to support them, to make them feel included? But with autistic people, it's no, we have to teach you how to speak English and act English and do those English things only in English ways. And any way that you act other than that, we're going to call that challenging behavior. We're going to call that, you know, that you're acting out, that you're, and this is where we are with it. And it's those little changes can make huge impacts.
Yeah, it's really changing that narrative on the social norm. It's saying there is no norm. There are infinite ways of being and perceiving, and it's making space in any way possible and co-producing at any stage possible. So meeting a child, young person, adult, whoever, exactly where they are, and involving them in that process. It's huge, and it seems like this, but it's very simple, right? It's coming right back down, but it's common sense, and instead we're pathologizing our own nature, and we ineffectively project lots of insecurity on what we don't understand.
There's a lot of projection there.
Yeah, and so if we create spaces and instead invite, have better relationships with ignorance, and invite conversations, say, I don't understand the way you might perceive or be, but can you share about it? Just it seems very simple, but it's a muscle to work. It's a muscle to it's a habit, right? And it's just saying, I don't get this, but I going beyond my own assumption, and it's asking that question. It's creating that space. So it's a beautiful way of looking at it through. It's a cross-cultural dialogue, but it's ultimately bringing everyone to the table. So yeah, thank you. That was a beautiful way to end it. I think open up the floor now. If we have questions, we'll spend about 5-10 minutes on questions. So if those watching have any questions, thoughts, comments, I'll leave 30 seconds for you to type it in there.
I think it's important as well to kind of, we're never looked at through a strengths model. It's always that deficit model. It's always about what can we fix and what needs fixing. And it's never about, no one ever kind of stops and thinks, well, actually, look at what they're amazing at. Look at what this individual, this child or this individual can do. And how can we use that to help them, to bolster them even further and to make them feel confident and feel good about themselves. But instead it's about, like, let's focus on perceived weakness and let's strengthen those perceived weaknesses. But to do it in a kind of I don't like the term neurotypical. I always try and stop myself and say non-autistic, but to do it in that kind of way, you know, and it's works so much better. I've seen it in action. I've seen it work. And when you enable an autistic child, it's you know, a non-speaking autistic child, you know, when you enable them with AAC and different communication devices and things, and you're not restricting them to using pictures, you know, it's kind of the amount of empowerment that is given, and the brain that is inside there that's literally hidden away by this ableist notion of they're not able to communicate, when in actual fact the communication can be expressed in so many different ways. We just the whole world just needs to change.
Yeah, no, I really love that, because it's looking at human nature through, I mean, I think a paradigm that you know, the theory of evolution brought us is that life is a competition, and that here we are with strengths and weaknesses. But in reality, I think human nature, when done at its, you know, when viewed through the best lens, is that of collaboration. It's playing on everyone's best strengths. It's bringing everyone's voice to the table. And really inclusion is based off of that. It's saying everyone has a brilliant, everyone can brilliantly contribute. It's
Everyone
just a
serves
mean.
a purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. Beautifully said. So we have a few. What do you think? Do you want to answer any? We have a question. Let's see. Your take on self-identification.
What's my take on self-identification? I think it's really important. I think it's absolutely valid. I know that there are people that think that, you know, nobody should say that they're autistic unless they're given a diagnosis. But even as we've touched on today, there are huge problems with the diagnostic process and the diagnostic criteria. There are massive barriers to getting diagnosed, and I don't even call professional diagnosis. I call it professional validation, because it's effectively a rubber stamp of who you are. That's it. And even if you go for diagnosis and you don't get that diagnosis, that doesn't even necessarily mean that you're not autistic. That just means that that person on that given time might have missed things, or might have interpreted things in the wrong way, or or their interpretation of what the diagnostic criteria is might be quite rigid and might not be as flexible as others. And so I think it's a really, really important thing. And there isn't a late diagnosed person that hasn't self-identified at some point, you know, even if it's just for a week, you know, because it's kind of like, once you have that, oh, that could be me, and once you go out and search for more information and you think, oh my god, this is really relatable, this is really like me, I think having it as a medical diagnosis is really problematic, because it shouldn't, that just fulfills the deficit, kind of the notion, and the kind of medicalized view of kind of it. And it isn't just a medicalized thing. We have neuro kind of biological mechanical differences, obviously, but this is about identity as much as anything else.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of putting it, because it's a validation from one point of view, when really when I think when people have representation of different neurodivergent viewpoints, we can see, and with everything, like we have you know, certain speakers, certain words, certain poets, writers will resonate with each of us all differently. So I think when we have that capacity to look at a piece of representation and say, this feels like me, that is a point of liberation and self-identification, which I feel like it never really ends across a lifetime. We never, as is, we're sort of a diagnosis might give us some temporality, some timeline, but really self evolvement, that process is limitless, and it's giving a person that freedom to be into a self-evolve.
I mean, that really encapsulates me to a degree, because when, like, well, obviously a long time ago when I got diagnosed, and back then, this was 2003, so there was nothing about autistic adults anywhere, like no real information. It was Temple Grandin or bust, you know, that was it, or Rain Man. And I didn't relate to either of those kind of projections, you know, like I didn't relate to Temple Grandin. I certainly didn't relate to Rain Man. So because there was nothing out there for me as an adult, it was all for children. I didn't know what to do with it. So I had this diagnosis and didn't know what to do with it. So I just parked it and shelved it, and then spent pretty much the next decade forgetting about it and ignoring it and going through the same cycles of mental health problems and burnout and acting in the same way. I got my real diagnosis when I found the autistic community, and all of a sudden there were all these stories around me that were talking about me. You know, it was like I walked into a room, and all these different versions of me popped up and started parroting back to my life back to me. You know, that was my real diagnosis. That was when I was related, and I identified with it, and it became really, really important for me. And up until that point, despite having that professional diagnosis, it meant nothing. It was meaningless. So having the two together is really, really important to me. But having that extra information, is having the insight, is the validity to it.
Really curious. Yeah, right, because it gives you a sense of here's this label out there, and again, it's just reckoning with the external nature of self. It's the external, here's what I'm presenting at this moment, but it you know, we present differently and we resonate differently with different things across lifetimes, but it's having that giving yourself permission, finding spaces to just say, actually, this is me, and I'm changing all the time, and hopefully getting to a point where we have communities that allow that process to really flourish for people, you know. Yeah, absolutely. So yes, let me think. So I think that's about it when it comes to questions. If we get follow-up questions, am I all right to forward them on?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, so thank you so much for your time, Kieran, and energy. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. I hope the discussion has been useful, interesting, stimulating, encouraging, whatever you want. So with that, with those watching, we'd love feedback on the Sen Explained series. So as a follow-up to those registered, I'll send an impact evaluation. So that's talking about sort of the quality of the speakers, the discussion. We'd love to keep improving this series and speaking to needs that exist and conversations that are relevant and continue to be relevant. So I'll be sending that along, and really hope to see you all engaging. So thank you so much, everyone. And I'll say good night, signing off.